By the time of the War of the Ring, Eriador is known primarily for how wild and depopulated it is. In fact, the only major settlement of men is at Bree and its surrounding villages. But around 100 years earlier, this wasn't the case. Further south, along the River Guaflo, the town of Tharbad had also survived the Third Age, largely unimportant and forgotten. Unfortunately, this would not last. In 2912, the Third Age, Tharbad was devastated by floods and was ruined and abandoned. That said, what happened to the people who lived there? What happened to the people of Tharbad? Tharbad is an interesting place. It was founded by the Númenóreans at the end of the Second Age, serving as Arnor's major port and as the main crossing of the River Guaflo, because it was situated at the border of Arnor and Gondor and was vital for the communication and trade between the two kingdoms. It was jointly garrisoned. Along with soldiers and mariners, this garrison was noteworthy because it also contained many engineers, because even though Tharbad lacked the grandeur of other cities and fortresses built by the Númenóreans, it was an engineering marvel nonetheless. You see, Tharbad was built in a place where settlements are not supposed to be built, in a swamp. But because it was seemingly the best place to cross the River Guaflo, the Númenóreans fought against nature. They drained the marshlands and dredged the river to allow ships to dock there. They built a large causeway for the road and then built a long bridge across the river. As you can imagine, all of this work required maintenance, and being lax might mean that nature would reclaim the site. So it was a pretty big deal when the descendants of the Númenóreans, the Dunedain, mostly abandoned Tharbad. It's unsure when the Arnorian garrison pulled out. It might have been in 1409 when Cardolan was ravaged by Angmar, or it might have been in 1636 when the Great Plague wiped out what was left of Cardolan. Gondor seems to have withdrawn its own garrison in 1636 in order to pull back troops to defend Gondor's heartlands, and by the time of the Stewards, Gondor had completely relinquished control over Anadwaith. When the Dunedain left, they took their expertise with them, leaving Tharbad in the hands of middlemen who lacked that same knowledge and abilities. What we know is that after the Dunedain left, the region started to decay. Without the expertise of the Dunedain, the great works of the Númenóreans could not be maintained as well, and realistically, there was less reason to maintain it. The north-south traffic had dwindled over the course of the Third Age, and that only accelerated after the end of Arnor in 1974. By the time of the War of the Ring, there was so little contact between north and south that places like Gondor weren't even truly aware of places like the Shire. The reason I'm saying this is that it's important to understand that while Tharbad may have been a town in name, it probably became less of a town in function as the Third Age progressed. The population probably dwindled quite a lot as parts of the town fell into ruin or were reclaimed by nature. We're unsure when the bridge across the Guaflo collapsed. If it collapsed before the final ruin of the town, that also would have had a major impact on the town, removing the ease of crossing the river, and also severely hampering whatever trade might have been left. So when Tharbad was finally ruined in 2912, there's a good chance that its population was quite low at this point. I can't give you a number with any evidence, but it might have been as low as a few hundred, and realistically, I don't think it could have been any higher than a few thousand. I suspect that by this time, Bree was larger and more important, owing to the fact that there was still plenty of east-west trade compared to north-south trade. With all of that out of the way, then what happened to the people who lived in Tharbad? Realistically, there's only two options. The first is that they mostly moved away. Over time, as the town became more ruinous, more and more of the locals might have abandoned it, seeking lands elsewhere. When the town was finally completely ruined, those who remained would have then also packed up all of their belongings that could be saved and moved on elsewhere. So I'd say the real mystery is where they went, and there's a couple of viable options. I'd say the two most likely options were Bree and Dunland. Although there is a decent distance between Tharbad and Bree, the two towns were absolutely aware of each other. We know this because during the War of the Ring, there were refugees from the south, probably from Dunland or Enedwaith, who made the journey up the Greenway to Bree. This suggests that refugees from Tharbad might have done something similar 100 years earlier. That said, I only think this option is likely if the population of Tharbad was quite small. After all, Bree wasn't a sprawling metropolis itself. The town is said to have had 100 stone houses, and the 3 other villages of Archet, Combe, and Staddle were even smaller. Realistically, the whole region may have only had a few thousand people living there. The other major option was Dunland. The land was much closer to Tharbad than Bree, it was a much larger land with a much larger population, and it's likely that the surviving men of Tharbad and the Dunlendings were closely related by blood, just as they were with the men of Bree. That said, there are some issues. The Dunlendings would have been more primitive compared to the men of Tharbad, who would have at least retained some practices and knowledge from the Dunedain. And there's the language issue. The men of Tharbad probably spoke Westron, which wasn't widely known in Dunland. But if Tharbad had been growing closer to Dunland over the centuries, the people there might have had decent knowledge of Dunlendish. There's a couple of other minor options. Depending on how few they were, the survivors might have just scattered into the wilderness where families could survive in lone homesteads or lodges. When the Nazgul passed through Enedwaith and Minhiriath while hunting for the ring, it is mentioned that a few lonely men flee from the road, possibly the descendants of those who lived in Tharbad. Other wildcard options could be Erin Vaughan or the coasts of Enedwaith, where related men had always lived. However, these men were even more isolated and primitive than the Dunlendings. Another option could be Isengard. Saruman might have heard of their plight and brought them into his employ. Okay, so what's the other option? Well, it's simple. They died. Okay, not all of them. Of course, people would have migrated away from Tharbad over time, and there must have been at least some survivors from when it was ruined. But what I'm saying is that most of them, most of those who remained in the town, might have died when the town was abandoned. But how? Well, firstly, the town was ruined in a flood. Floods are dangerous, especially if they happen rapidly. And even if you survive the flood, if everything you own and all of your food has been destroyed, you might then just die of starvation, sickness, or exposure. I will also point out that the floods were widespread across Minhiriath and Enedwaith, so it wasn't just Tharbad that was hit. And also, the flood was preceded by something pretty deadly in itself, an event called the Fell Winter. Basically, just a really terrible winter. This winter wasn't as bad as the Long Winter of 150 years earlier, but it was still deadly. For example, the Shire was invaded by white wolves, and the hobbits started facing starvation. They only avoided this because Gandalf and the Rangers provided them with aid. The men of Tharbad were probably better at surviving than the hobbits, but if they suffered the exact same problems and then faced widespread ruinous floods, it's certainly not a stretch to assume that many of them may have died. So yeah, while some probably survived to set up shop elsewhere, it's possible that the majority of them perished either during the Fell Winter or the following floods. If this was the case, the history of Tharbad suddenly becomes far more grim. Instead of it being an empty ruin, it becomes a graveyard of those who perished due to natural disaster, starvation, or the elements. Honestly though, Eriador went through enough death and destruction over the years, so I really hope it was the former option. Actually, let's go with the most wholesome, optimistic option possible, that one of Bree's villages, such as Combe or Archet, was actually founded by people from Tharbad. I left out Staddle because it was inhabited mostly by hobbits. But to be honest, things in Middle-earth were rarely that wholesome. I'd expect that even if many of the folk of Tharbad managed to move away, there were certainly many deaths during the Fell Winter and the following floods. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. This video was actually a suggestion from one of the comments. Please do boast in the comment section if that was you. At first, I didn't give much thought to the idea, but then I was like, hey, that's actually pretty good. And Tharbad is part of Arnor, which means I can't not make a video about it. Cheers, farewell, and remember, I wonder if Tharbad was ever Thargood. Yes, I made that joke about Gundabad already, I don't care.